Good evening, everybody. My name is E.R. Anderson. I'm the Executive Director of Charis Circle. Charis Circle is a nonprofit programming arm of Charis Books, and Charis Books is the South's oldest independent feminist bookstore. We're so honored to welcome Bettina Judd tonight in conversation with Opal Moore for a discussion of Feelin, creative practice, pleasure, and Black feminist thought. How creativity makes its way through feeling and what we can know and feel through the aesthetic work of Black women. Bettina Judd is an interdisciplinary writer, artist, and performer whose research focus is on Black women's creative production and our use of visual art, literature, and music to develop feminist thought. Her book, Feelin, Creative Practice, Pleasure, and Black Feminist Thought, is out from Northwestern University Press now, and you can buy it here from Charis Books, whether you're watching virtually or here with us physically in the room. In the book, it argues that Black women's creative production is feminist knowledge production, produced by registers of affect she calls Feelin. She is currently Associate Professor of Gender, Women, and Sexuality Studies at the University of Washington. And she is joined tonight by Opal Moore, who is the author of Lot's Daughters and text collaborator for Children of Middle Passage, a performance artwork conceived with visual artist Arturo Lindsay and jazz musician Joe Jennings. Moore, now retired from Spelman College, taught creative writing, African American literature, and co-created and taught the first women's studies seminar course on the radical Black feminist, lesbian, poet, and writer Audre Lorde, and developed the senior seminar on the prolific and transformative womanist writer Alice Walker. Moore's poems, stories, and essays are published in various journals and anthologies, including Honey Hush, an anthology of African American women's humor, and Furious Flower, Seeding the Future of African American Poetry. Her writing has appeared in the Boston Review, the Connecticut Review, Callaloo, the Notre Dame Review, and elsewhere. Opal is a Fulbright Scholar, Cave Canem Fellow, and Bellagio Fellow. She serves as poetry editor for the art section, an online journal, art and commentary, and fiction editor for Obsidian, literature and the arts in the African diaspora. She's a founding board member of the Wintergreen Women's Writers Collective, 35 years of Black women supporting one another's creative production. So we're so honored to be here with all of you tonight. We have a great crowd here physically with us in Decatur, and we have a great crowd gathered around the world virtually. So I am going to kick it over to Opal Moore now, and to just say real quick, if folks have questions, if you're in the virtual room, you can put them in the chat at any time. Folks have questions in the room with us, I'm going to be passing around the mic towards the end, and we'll have a robust hybrid discussion among all of us. So please welcome Opal Moore.
Oops. All right, let's start again. Oops. So are we ready? Yeah. So what a pleasure to be here. I want to thank everybody who's in the room, all of our listeners and readers and lovers of the work of Bettina Judd. Thank you for tuning in virtually. And it is just my pleasure to be here. What a wonderful moment to be able to sit and talk with you about your work, Bettina. And also, should I call you Professor Judd?
That is so weird. Like you're still Professor
So
Moore.
I'm just going to put that out there because this is Professor Bettina Judd. And your marvelous work, Feelin. And I was just over listening to some of the folks in the room, and they were expressing what I felt as I read this work, and that is that I needed to have this 20, 30 years ago. That wasn't possible, but now let's see what it can do for women in my category who are just getting this book. I would suggest that this is a work that really helps us to read other works that we've read, and as well as teaching us what interdisciplinarity can look like. And I actually thought I would want to talk to you, just start off talking about that. But it's my understanding that you want to open this program reading?
Yeah,
Do you have some, or, okay,
excerpt
fantastic,
of it,
thank you.
just so there's. We were talking a little bit about this photograph that I couldn't get permissions for. So I'm going to read an excerpt and just direct people to go to the MoMA website for the Roy DeCarla collection there, and you can see this photograph. But this is just from the introduction. Feel me. In the delirium of a felt life is the made thing, and making a thing worth feeling for. I lose myself in the frenzied rapture called life, can attest to having felt, and in that heightened state of life, create. The evidence of creation means that I came out on the other side of rapture, and yet I am still in it. We now, me, you, reader, viewer, listener, are still in it, even as I may have moved on to the next thing. If I know anything, I know how to bend time this way. The pen, the flickering cursor, the soft flesh in the throat and its sounds, the pastel's residue on my oily fingertips, my small bit of power the universe has given. Living with arduous time, global pandemics, war, genocide, extinctions, and destruction of habitable lands and clean water, one could ask if artistic creation matters at all. If creative practice is frivolous, ornamental, or in poor taste in respect to our current conditions. To a question like this, I offer the poet's response in Ntozake Shange's The Lizard series. She says, "This is why poetry is enough, Isa. It brings us to our knees, and when we look up from puddles of sweat, the world's still right there, and the children still have bruises, tiny white satin caskets, and their mothers weep like Mary should. There's nothing more sacred than a glimpse of power in the universe. It brought James Brown to his knees, Lil Anthony too, even Jackie Wilson, arrogant, petty motherfucker he was, dropped no knee pads in the face of the might we have to contend with. And sometimes young Black boys bleed to death face down on asphalt, because falling to our knees is a public admission to a great big old scarlet letter that we don't want to escape any feeling. Any sensation of being alive can come right down on us. And yes, my tears and sweat may decorate the ground like a veve in Haiti or a sand drawing in Melbourne, but in the swooning, in the delirium of a felt life lies a poem to be proud of. Does it matter? Can you stand up, child? Well, how does it feel to live amid global disaster? What do you know of it? Disaster is here, has been here, will be here, even as we are torn up along with it. To run from feeling is to attempt to run from disaster itself. And exactly where are you going anyway? As the late Nina Simone said in a moment of grief for the very recent loss of Dr. Martin Luther King, quote, "Folks, you better stop and think and feel again," end quote. For it is not the feeling that is frivolous, but the avoidance of that feeling that orders destruction, makes it unremarkable, ordinary. And truly, even if you don't feel, feeling is likely to catch up with you. No knee pads in the face. This book is interested in how Black women artists take our glimpse of power in the universe. How creativity makes its way through feeling, and what we can know with the work left behind. It is interested for the same reason some of the artist's words and work direct us toward the creative process as one of self-revelation, exploration, and need. Toni Morrison has described her own impulse toward writing in terms of a need, a longing to read something not yet written. She said, "Writing to me is an advanced and slow form of reading. If you find a book you really want to read, but it hasn't been written yet, you must write it." Renee Stout describes her creative process as the very purpose of her art as well. She says, "While I can make a piece and think it's nice, I want to be on to the next piece because I get everything from the process. The piece that I created is sort of the evidence of the process, but it's also for the viewer to enjoy whatever it is I was doing in my studio. But I want to be on the actual act of creating the work. The work, what is left behind, is evidence that something has happened here. We may enjoy the evidence of that experience's status, the gallery, the recording. And if we're lucky, we might peek into to catch a glimpse of the universe's power in motion. For example, in the photograph, Edna Smithy Dutt's eyes are closed and her mouth is relaxed. If there is any expression here, it is inward. She is in the moment of making music happen. We can tell by the blurred movement of her ring finger as she plays the upright bass. The scene is dark, but there is a hint of artificial light emanating from a square box above and to the left of Sweet's head. Save for the shine from a metallic watch on her wrist, the glimmer of the tuning keys on the bass, and a soft light bouncing off of her forehead, nose, and hand, the rest is darkness. We might see the silhouette of something in the background, but the light of the image is Smith herself in a moment of creative expression that we cannot touch or hear, save for this remnant, for this evidence, a photo offering only proof of this moment having taken it all. Where DeCarva is known for these kinds of intimate portraits, but I'd never seen one quite like this. A Black woman artist deeply in an internal space of creativity. What might strike the viewer is that it's hard to situate this photograph in time. Even the shadow of Smithy Dutt's clothes could be mistaken for a more recent era than 1955 when it was taken. There is nothing she is doing, no way she is staged, no visual cue that says she is in any other time but now. Edna Smithy Dutt was a lifelong musician and music educator. In addition to playing with the International Sweethearts of Rhythm, an all-female jazz big band, especially popular during World War II, she also led her own jazz trio, traveled to Ghana and Nigeria to learn and teach Black diasporic music, and returned to New York to continue teaching music anthropology with an expertise in diasporic children's songs at Medgar Evers and Queens colleges. Her studies and recordings of Black children's songs and games are still available to us. Knowing all of that does not mean I can glean what chord she was striking, how it felt to her, and how it felt to be in this moment of making. But I do have this photo. And the sculpture was just an idea, a sketch of a monument that would never be cast or put on display. But for Medavo or Fuller, it was worth keeping close in the small quarters of her attic studio. She would render more well-known works from this same room where, in memory of Mary Turner as a silent protest against mob violence, would sit. It's only a foot tall, unimposing in size, but heavy in content. As a memorial for Mary Turner, who was brutally lynched by a mob in Valdosta, Georgia in 1918. I wonder about this insistence on proximity. Necessary because of the size of Fuller's studio was very small, but also necessary as a personal talisman, a remembrance for the stakes of living as a Black woman in America. Here, Fuller is in her studio working at this sculpture. She's in a smock, her hair only slightly disheveled. It's a drastically different photo from the one in her parlor wearing the fashions of a middle-class woman in the early 20th century. Again, though aware of the camera and perhaps because of her smock and disheveled hair, she, like Edna Smithy Dutt, appears to be suspended in time, at work, without the trappings of the era in an ever-present state. The photograph is high grain because of the technical limitations of low light photography at the time. It is not the artistic move of the DeCarva photograph, but it appears as timeless nonetheless. The same sun emanating through two small windows, the clay forming underneath Fuller's hands, the clutter of her attic studio appearing as homely as anyone's attic. If you're lucky, A photograph may be left behind. But what we usually have, also, if we're lucky, is the art itself. The evidence of having been in the studio, the rehearsal hall, the desk. It is a gift of what we call the work, documented, published, recorded, or performed for an audience's pleasure. And it is work, isn't it? To develop a craft, hone it, master it, or deliberately choose not to master, to reach for something other than the craft itself. To collaborate, choose the precise color, brush stroke, lighting, chord, the most exacting word that will communicate the very thing, yes, perhaps said before, but newly felt. For there are new ideas, as one poet said. There are only new ways of making them felt.
Mm-hmm.
This project is interested in that effort. And Black Feminist Thought made possible through art, what I call feelin, or the affective sedulity of Black women's creative process that takes place in the studio, where the work of art making, tinkering, experimenting, emoting, and sensing happens and may manifest in the photographic series, collections of poetry, songs, albums, or not available to an audience at all. I'm interested in the impulse to create because it was a book the writer needed to read, an image that brought the painter sinister joy to stroke through, or a note that vocalists needed to reach. This project is interested in the motivations, the will and compulsion to make art through the weight of needing to feel, the affective sedulity that compels the artist to create, and most importantly, the knowledge produced in the delirium of a felt life.
All right, thank you. So I think we did the right thing in opening with your voice, with you, and having us here. You choose that passage. And I just want to go back into some of the things that you were saying, because what I realized not long into this work is that everything here matters. And I was admiring just the way that this thing is organized. So for those of you who are going home with the book, you'll see the organization really also speaks to this project. You refer to this book as a project and not a book. And so I do want to talk about it in that way, because I agree that this is a project, and projects then are not lonely. The way that you're bringing in all these people in the book. I started to make a list of all the folks that you were referencing and drawing in, and sort of moving through other people's work. So for example, Barbara Christian in 1987, The Race for Theory. Well, there's a note that's toning from Barbara Christian all the way through this work, which is to say, what is criticism? And who's hijacking criticism? And how are we gonna make this language work for us? So I do wanna talk about the shape of the work, the motion of it, the voice of it. And one of the things that struck me, the beautiful design of this work, is that you begin with water. When I opened this book, you begin with the orca whale.
Yeah.
What is her name?
Tahlequah.
Tahlequah.
And interestingly enough, when I talked to the folks at the Well Museum that got the donors together to name her, they also pronounce her name Tahlequah, which I like. It's like I was saying that too, you know, like we're here, yeah, but it's Tahlequah.
Tahlequah. And so Tahlequah is an orca whale, and please give us that story.
Yeah, so Tahlequah was an orca. Her kind of she's a member of the southern resident orcas that are in that kind of frequent the Puget Sound region, or just north of the Puget Sound region in the Salish Sea. They're part of the J pod, and so she is J35. And in the summer of 2018, which is the summer that my father, James Russell Judd, passed away, she gave birth to a baby calf that immediately died. And she carried the calf's body on her back for 17 days, and was obviously in great distress. So the scientists tracking her, that are affiliated with my same job at the University of Washington, were, tracking her and concerned with her. She wasn't eating. Anytime the baby's body would fall back into the ocean, she would dive down to pick it up and carry it again while her pod was, searching for food. And if you know kind of what is happening with orcas' food sources, there is a limit. The Chinook salmon are endangered, and so orcas finding food is difficult already, and their habitats are kind of compromised already. So I saw not just like the Seattle Puget Sound region like really kind of rally around this grieving whale, but also the world. Like there was a whole poetry project where people were writing poems dedicated to Tahlequah, and outside of that, I had been experiencing kind of cumulative grief. When I moved to the Seattle region 2 years prior, in 2016, I immediately lost my grandmother, and in the same month, 2 cousins. Then later that year, and it was just on and on and on. So I think I say it was about 12 people, and so it seems like I was traveling across country to go to a funeral every other month or every 3 months. And so I had like a backlog of grief to do. But when my father passed away that same summer, I was scaring myself with my ability to go on the next day. Like I was in the middle of a move. There were signs that I was not computing well. Like there were signs that I was clearly not making sense to people, or like my logic wasn't making sense to people, but I was in the middle of a move when I got the phone call. The movers literally came 20 minutes after I got that phone call that my father passed away. And so I continued to move. Like the plan was to go to the funeral. I went to the funeral, then I got on a plane from that funeral in North Carolina to come here to the archives at Emory to continue writing the book. And I did that. Like beep bop boop. And so like what I think the corollary to how my grief process was working was like if you have a Mac and you get like the rainbow wheel of death, like it was like that. And it was as if the story of Tahlequah like closed a program for me. When when my whole processing system could not close the program to make room for grief. And so, because it did that for me, I had no intentions of writing a chapter on grief in the book. Like the book already had its chapters. It made sense that it would have, however many, like it made sense that it would have 6 chapters, like intro, 4 chapters in the middle and a conclusion. That's solid. That's more than a lot. But now, like, oh shoot, I need to do something about this grief. And so the first chapter, it's kind of about the stakes of this project. And so the first feeling, the first affect is grief, and is this artist processing grief, and then also thinking about it in relation to Black study.
Right. So I like your So I like your process, but I was also amazed at how you were able to lay this body of work across your body and not have it be anything but a creative work. And I got my copy of Patience, and I began wondering actually about the timing of this work. At first I said, oh, okay, the dates mean that Patient came first and then Feelin came next. But I began to wonder whether it's that linear and whether these works, because in the work itself, these works are linked. They are profoundly linked and woven. They also, I thought that I had read Patient. And then when I was reading Feelin, I realized you haven't read Patient. You actually need to go back and read this work, because these works then are commenting on each other, but they're also filling each other out. So I want to just read the table of contents, introduction, feel me, and you go on to talk about the difference between feeling and feeling. And chapter 1, a Black study in grief, and how Black studies is really located in grief, and how perhaps the reason why Black studies has not had the kind of effect that folks in the 1960s and 70s thought it would have when we were protesting for Black studies, so that there is a way that we could return to Black studies, not excising the grief, not just giving us the numbers and the data, but asking about feeling, right? In other words, do we dare to actually feel our history, or do we have to hold it off at a distance because of the power of that history? So that question, do we dare? Why not, Jericho? Don't be out there. Okay, so there's that. Chapter 2, Lucille Clifton's A Theology of Joy. I'm going to tell you the truth. When I saw Lucille Clifton, I skipped to Lucille, and I was loving what Lucille had done around joy. There's that. And then ecstatic vocal practice. We always knew that there was a lot of sex in the church, but whoever really talks about it except James Baldwin. So there's that. And then chapter 4, shame in the visual field of Black motherhood. How the struggle of mothering, when all of the work that we look at in terms of the ways that Black women, as you say, how we're living as Black women in America and in the world, that work to make us ashamed of our mothers, perhaps that work to make our mothers ashamed of us. How do we do motherhood in that kind of, within those awful parameters? And then chapter 5, toward a methodology of anger. Now, see, you blew me away here when you said you were mad at your mother, but you had to hold off because Mom was telling you about a ritual of anger that she participated in as a student at University of Maryland. I was just like, hold up. So you're going back there to retrace the steps of your mother establishing a ritual of anger. I don't want to preempt that, but I just want to say it's in there. And I thought, wow, what does it mean to construct a ritual of anger whereby you can experience your anger? It can serve you in the way that Audre Lorde has suggested that anger might serve us. I'm going on a bit because I want to just lay this out there, and then I'm just going to say, tell us about that.
Right.
And then finally, I said you begin with ocean, or you begin with water, and you end with water. The end, everything in the ocean. And I like that question of where you say, if this is the apocalypse, what will we need to do to learn how to live in another space where we cannot breathe? So now the table of contents will just knock you down right there. But I was thinking, I don't know how I'm gonna need help with the time here because we could go for it right here. But what I'm gonna ask you is this. Where would you say the fulcrum of this work sits in this book? What would you say is the fulcrum? Because grief, you talk about grief throughout, we explore it throughout, but you also talk about joy and the work of Lucille Clifton. And for those of you who don't know her, Emory has the Lucille Clifton Archive, and that's where you were doing this work. So is anger the fulcrum in the management of Black women's anger? Grief, what is the role of grief in our self-recovery? Because we don't normally think of grief as a tool for self-recovery. But I want to turn this over to you because this work has such an impeccable logic, a kind of logical feeling. Where would we begin as we talk about one of these really extraordinary moments in this book? We know that that's what we're doing. We're doing grief, we're doing anger, we're doing joy, we're doing ecstasy. We're teaching ourselves in this book. And I like Renee Stout's point where she says, the work just says something happens here. To think of the work as remnant rather than the point is extraordinary. That actually resides in the philosophy of the artist. It does not reside in the philosophy of the academy. Yeah. You also give us that question of, what's happening in the academy that is extracting the joy, the ecstasy, the beauty, the suffering from the work that we do there as well. So help me out here. Where do we land? Where do we land, Bettina, Bettina and Professor Judd, to allow us to get a feel for this book in a rather brief time that we have?
So first of all, can I say how surreal this moment is? Right? Like, if you don't know, Professor Opal Moore was my professor at Spelman College. And so to hear...
And so now you're my professor.
To hear my professor...
teach me.
But to hear, you, like, talk my work back to me, and it's not because I, didn't get an A. And just, and also like, being in, seminal writers course.
Yeah.
Right, with you. And also having, like, it was the first time I got to learn a text by the person who wrote it, because that's where I read Lost Daughters for the first time. And I still, this one, still one of my favorite collections of poetry.
Thank you.
Yeah. So this is really an out of body experience I'm having right now. Like, I've been like going back in my mind. It's like, am I in Cosby? What is happening right now? Yeah, amazing. So I think for the question about time and linearity, it is remarkably nonlinear, and it's been a really amazing thing to think about in retrospect.
Yeah.
How nonlinear the project is, like, not just in the scope of time that I sat down to make it a project, but the way that it's grounded, in this refrain about and researching my mother's anger, that it kind of goes back to me being with my mother as a child and seeing, feeling, experiencing what song means like in that space. So my mother is like a classically trained singer, and would often be like asked to do solos for people's weddings, and she was often a soloist at church, and she also just loved to sing. And so we would be in the car and she would be practicing a song, and I'm like little off-key 3-year-old, 4-year-old singing with her, and but it didn't take long for me to realize that singing and practicing the piano and singing was a particular practice and space for her. Okay, like she was my mom, but she was also like not my mom in those moments. And it was like I got to witness her be a person. And I really needed that. Like I really needed a way to see my mother be in the world. That wasn't about her being my caregiver. And I think that was the primary way that I saw her in that way. And then this story that she would tell me, and I had no idea why she would be telling me this story, but she continually told me this story that was about her ritual of anger, that she, would go to the library, check out Charles Carroll's The Negro Beast, and get mad. And so it was just so she could get mad. And and she would say, I don't know why I wanted to do that. I would just go to, and so the fact that I was at another one of the University of Maryland system schools, and I went to check out this book, and I don't know if it's the same book. It probably could be. It's in special collections at this point because it's a rare book. And so to think what am I actually looking for? Like everything in this book is ridiculous to me. Like there's nothing in it that can touch me that I can actually feel angry about. Because I had been taught about it. My mother had metabolized all of the nonsense in it and just therefore told me the story about this is stuff I was angry about. And so in that way, I wouldn't say that it's just like anger that's kind of the fulcrum, but it is that relation of love that would metabolize this nonsense information, which the Negro Beast is like this ridiculous kind of pseudoscientific, pseudo theological text about why Black people aren't from the same genetic lineage as white people, right? And it uses both biblical text and pseudoscience to argue this, right? So I'm and that doesn't touch me anymore, in the same way that it touched her.
Yeah.
And so in some ways, the fulcrum is love is in that respect, and so that even looking at, the idea of this field of Black motherhood, this thing that makes me want to go to it and explore it is that being a girl child of the 90s, I've had my fair share of the propaganda of being wary of Black motherhood, right? Every sitcom had that one episode or one character that was the tragic tale of a teen mom. And, right to the point that Tupac's first hit was a tragic tale of a teen mom. I think for a 7-year-old, I thought more about infants in garbage cans than might be normal. But that was the narrative, right? And so, but I didn't have that feeling when it came to my own mother. And dude, are like all of us getting this kind of weird kind of relationship to the idea of mothering and looking at our own mothers and our own grandmothers and so I had to look at the visual field. Like, what is out there? What are the images? What are they often telling us? What is the narrative? What are the problems with the narrative? And so, we can start with like the idea of the maternal in general and Black motherhood and the mammy figure as this first image of shame, this image that we need to fix. Black artists have been trying to fix this image for decades, and it's still messy. At this point, Quaker has just erased it all because there's no way to reform this image, right? So now it's the Pearl Milling Company, and we just have to, they just have a little thing in the corner of the box that says, "Remember Aunt Jemima? It's the same thing." So we still have to have her in our minds to even recognize this product. And so that kind of intimate knowledge or that intimate relationship to the field of Black motherhood is what kind of produced that, or was the impetus of that chapter, and became what it was.
So you mentioned mammy. Again, I don't know what my time frame is here, but I'm trying to sort of figure out a way that the power of this work and this organization operates. And you did a series called Text of Rage, Mississippi Goddamn.
Mm-hmm.
Text number one.
Right.
Text of Rage, Patient.
Mm-hmm.
But I was also thinking of, first of all, I think I neglected to mention that this book is perforated with opportunities for you to leave the book and go somewhere and do something in relation, this interdisciplinarity where you're moving in and out of the text deliberately and according to the plan of the author. And so I'm thinking about Sandra Bland's arrest and death also as a text, a text of rage. What you do with that text is to ask us to really hear what's being said. And somewhere in this work, you suggest that anger is useful because it's almost like, and this is my metaphor, but it's almost like, in a treasure hunt, on the treasure map, X marks the spot. If X marks the spot of your anger, that's where knowledge lies. In other words, you really should ask yourself, as you did, why am I angry? So if you ask yourself, why am I angry? Then you get to mine that text. You get to dig into that moment, that spark, that anger, and say, what is going on here? What is it that that I know somewhere in me, somewhere in my feelings, somewhere in my body, somewhere I know what this is, but my mind has to be brought around so that this interdisciplinarity is a way of moving us away from the notion that all knowledge resides in the cognitive, and to remind us that much of what we know precedes the cognitive. We have to tease it out and figure out what's there. So you take us to the text of Sandra Bland, and what's the officer's name?
Brian
Insenius, and walk us through with his dialogue and then with his dialogue stripped away, trying to get us to actually pay attention to what Sandra Bland knows. She's in that space in knowledge. Have I got this right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So why then, if anger is the X that marks the spot of a buried knowledge, you say elsewhere that I know I'm getting into some dangerous territory here talking about mad, angry Black women, but we do need to talk about angry Black women. Audre Lorde tried to talk about angry Black women, and she tried to talk about it not as a loss of of intelligence and control, but as something else. So you said that this book, The Fulcrum, is love, but it suggests to me that we're gonna have to find our way back to love, and all these other hard things that we're doing are the way that we get there. So could you help us then? Because I would not think that Sandra Bland's text would somehow make love more available to us. Work it out for us. Help us to figure out what it is that the body knows that the mind can't figure out, and then the heart needs to connect with as well.
I think, so I'll end with the tonic note of how we get back to love.
Yeah.
So, by doing the kind of redaction and annotation of the transcript of the conversation between Bland and the police officer, like we see that she is making direct statements to what is happening, and he's kind of circumventing it with authoritative niceties, right? So like, and she is not responding to those, like she's not responding to those authoritative niceties, which would demand that she say, actually, everything is fine. Everything that you're doing right now is fine, officer. This makes absolute sense that you're doing this to me, officer. No, she is always responding like, there was no reason why I should be stopped. I don't have to take out my cigarette. You were already trailed. Like she's like telling the truth consistently. And he wants to like cover it up with this kind of like, and he wants, and she will, and that's where she doesn't comply. Like that's the non-compliance, right? It's not like whatever he probably put down in his report, right? It is her absolute refusal to say that I deserve to be pulled over. And so I think for me, when thinking about the fulcrum as love, I think I'm being somewhat myopic, right? In the way that I am thinking through this with the lens of Black feminist thought and a Black feminist rendering of what it means to hear her, right? So I know the way that I experienced watching that video that I cannot watch anymore. And reading the transcript, this like love for her and wanting to hear her and wanting to be in the space and intervene and wanting to put my body like just all like and identifying with her like on a very visceral level. At the time, I was a new faculty member in a new town driving around, right? Like that is what she was doing. She was living my life, right? And this happened to her, and I saw how it could happen all the time. I saw how it has happened. It didn't end up in that kind of extreme. And so there is and I saw how other Black women were responding in the same kind of like wide-eyed, this, see, it's happening. Like that kind of reaction and continual kind of outpouring of like, wanting to be in between in the space. And I think that's where I find the fulcrum to be love, right? Is the Black feminist lens of taking Black women's knowledge seriously.
And I would also say, because Sandra Bland is demonstrating her love for herself, that is incolorable.
Absolutely.
That is incolorable in the moment of the arrest. She's supposed to, give that I'm gonna ask ER if we have time, or are we going to questions, or where are we?
I think one more question from you, maybe, and then we'll move to
All right, great. Okay, all right. Well, since we have a little more time, I want to just go back then to the shape of the work. And you bring us back to the end, and what you do at the end is quite beautiful, in that you're bringing other artists and other writers into conversation on these subjects. Also, the Black Feminist Oceanographic. So I wonder if you could say a little bit about that, because that I felt was a place where, you know something that I don't know. And so what is that Black Feminist Oceanographic? But also just the women that you're, the women and trans film artist at the close of the book, that brings us around and actually launches us, it seems to me, into the future. So could you spend a little time just at that closure and how it's made and what you're doing?
Yeah, so the closing is, I'm proposing a Black feminist oceanographic, like that this is stuff that's already happening. I'm naming something that I think is already kind of happening. And I wouldn't say that you don't know. I feel like there's a bit of that in Lost Daughters happening.
All right, we need to
Like,
talk.
what does it mean to have, you talk about it being these salty women, but
Yeah, right.
that idea that, of Lot's wife, right? Being this world ending figure.
Yeah.
Right? And what happens after it with Lot's daughter. See, I'm telling you, you're the OG. So this closing is to kind of, it does fold back on the idea of feeling itself, in the sense that I'm taking seriously that the natural world is changing. The oceans are rising. I am a coastal person in the sense that I think Atlanta is the most inland place I've ever lived. And what does it mean that we have to kind of adapt? Even though we are clearly choosing not to adapt.
Yeah.
Right, but that adaptation will be forced upon us.
Mm-hmm.
And the kind of the sense, the existential threat feeling that I think, even if there's some kind of denial, I think we're all kind of feeling like like what is future? Like, what does that even mean?
Yeah.
Should I even make plans? Like every New Year's, I'm like, oh, I used to do 5-year plans. They might be interrupted by like a catastrophe and I have to leave because I'm in West Seattle, right next to the water. Anyway, so I'm thinking about that, and I'm also taking seriously the what Indigenous as well as Black feminist scholars have been saying, is that, oh, we've done apocalypse before.
Yeah.
We've witnessed worlds ending.
Yeah.
So let's think about the strategies that we've had to do it and adapt them to this new reality of world ending. And so, June Jordan says, in that speech, some of us did not die. To be honest, I expect apocalypse.
Yeah.
Right. And so that is it's the way that Black feminist thought and Black feminist creativity does do that work, does expect an apocalypse in the sense that this world must end.
Yeah.
If the thing that we want, if we really want it, this thing must end. But how do we feel our way out of it? Like, how do we make sense of who we are in that? And so I was thinking, in the oceanographic, if we think about our particular world ending of the middle passage being a moment of, like, I'm also kind of hearkening to that, the oceanographic, that's letters and phenomenon and all of that, but how do we make sense of ourselves when language doesn't account for this, when our previous knowledge systems doesn't completely account for this, right? We use our other senses. And that goes into, which is to say, we use feeling.
Yeah, you have to feel it.
We feel our way through
Yeah, you gotta feel it.
this thing. And so the works of Alexa Cullen Gumbs, Audrey agrees, Tourmaline and others, Jacqueline Jones Munn, also another teacher, are all doing that work.
They are, they really are. Professor, thank you.
Thank you, Professor.
Bettina Judd.
Hi, everyone, our friends who are here with us physically in the room and our friends who are watching virtually to ask any questions you may have. We'll start with our folks here in the room. All right.
Do I have? Can you talk about how you make use of Lucille Clifton's work in the book?
Yes, so I shout out to Emery's Rare Book Manuscript. I'm sure I said that in the wrong order, manuscript and Rare Book Library. That most recent trip that was in 2018 was just my last trip. Like, I've been going to the archive since it like barely finished processing Lucille Clifton's papers. And so I was still in graduate school. And so that section is about joy. So if any of you had the pleasure in Clifton's lifetime to get a book signed, and you just got the word joy exclamation point and her name, you are not alone. Like, it didn't matter who you were. Like, I would like to meet. Have you had her write something more than joy?
Are you talking to me?
I'm talking to you, yes.
No, I never got her to sign a book.
Okay. So, like, you know.
I don't remember getting her to sign a book.
Yeah. So I have multiple books I've had that have been signed by her. I have gone to get a book signed by her for someone else with the directive, please get her to sign something other than joy exclamation point. It did not work out. I bought a a used book on Amazon that happened. It was a surprise that it was signed to Jessica. I don't know who this Jessica is, but she also got joy exclamation point. So it was like, this is what she does, right? And so I think, and also in one of the times that I actually got to talk to her, she was reading at the University of Maryland at a Poets Laureate reading. And she was all alone at the table, which I thought was wild, because every other context I've ever seen her in, she's mobbed by people, but she was all alone at this table, and they were talking to the other Maryland Poet Laureates. And so I was talking to her about how I loved her work. I actually talked about this interaction in the book. I love your work, and homage to my head. I just had this medical thing. I'm working on this book, poetry about my body and all this. Yeah. She's like, oh, but joy, right? Joy! Exclamation point. And so apparently she had a message about joy. And so I wanted to think about that very real way she communicated that personally, and then it does come up in her work, count it all joy as a phrase comes up in her work a lot. And what I found myself kind of realizing is that she is also thinking about the end of worlds a lot, but she's thinking about it at the moment of the beginning of the world that is kind of biblically rendered. So, she's raised Baptist, and at multiple points in her poetry over many decades, she revisits the fall of man, right? Which is a world-ending event. Eden is no longer. We're going out into the desert and suffering and all of that. Like, that's the new world. And so she revisits it multiple times, sometimes from the point of view of Lucifer, sometimes from the point of view of Eve, sometimes from the point of view of angels watching it happen, watching like all the, and she even kind of pulls back the scope further to say, okay, let's even before the fall of man, let's talk about a fall that happened before that, which is the fall of Lucifer, right? And so what Joy has to do with all of that is the kind of big theological question, the question of theodicy, which is if God is omnipotent, you know, and omnibenevolent and omnipresent, how do bad things happen in the world? And one big bad thing, and this was probably my question as a child, is if God is like everywhere and doing everything, why did God stop Eve from doing all that? You know, like if we really didn't want to eat the apple or the fruit, and why is there a tree of life? Like what? Like something isn't adding up. And I think she was asking the same question, like something isn't adding up. And so the why of why all this happens is about kind of what joy really might mean. And that is, you know, when she's responding and I'm talking about all this terrible stuff with my medical history, and she says, but joy, right? It is that, you know, it is the fact, you know, like she has this beautiful line where she's talking about the punishment of Eve and Adam, as in the punishment of man, you know, and like right up against all of the suffering is the scent of bread baking and love making, right? Like there's all of this beautiful image, like in the toiling, that's where kind of the beauty, that is where joy exists. And so she refashions Eve into this important figure, this kind of sapphire, this insurgent subject, I argue, that ushers in the end of the old world. And thus ushers in the possibilities for joy in the new.
Thank you.
It's a great chapter. I mean, all of them are great, but I love that, you know, yeah, we love Lucille. And I just love the work that she's doing around that, you know, that kind of, that story that has affected all of us in the way that we think about the world. Yeah. Another question from,
Hey, I have so many thoughts, questions, and feelings, but I think one that feels urgent to me is from the cover to the poems to the bits of autoethnography peppered throughout. Like, you really take yourself seriously as an artist, as a scholar, as a researcher, in ways that when I started grad school, they were like, yeah, you know, that's second book stuff. But this is, well, it's not first book stuff because Patient is in the world, but this is like, it's self-aware that it's a scholarly monograph and it is like shading that whole enterprise, but still performing it. And I guess I would love to hear you talk about the stakes of taking yourself seriously as an artist and a scholar and a party to this feeling, to this delirium, as you bring your first like scholarly monograph into the world.
yeah, great.
Yeah, I think, I do directly kind of talk to my senior committee. Because it was a way that, you know, this is what the book is for. And in all of those, in that context, it is the first book. You know, when I was on the the job market for the tenure track, I was asked, so you're gonna write a real book though, right? As delivered. I was like, I think Patient is a real book. Like it has binding. It has a whole ISBN number. It's on Amazon. Doesn't that make it real? So there is a way, like I was told those things too. That the creative intervention, that's your second book. And then I also noticed that there were a lot of on the precipice of retiring scholars that I admired and loved that suddenly would start writing novels. And I was like, I'm not gonna wait that long. And I think they worked hard enough for me to push the button right now. And also, this book isn't going to get written if I don't do it. Like on a very visceral level, this book isn't going to get written if I don't do this creative work. So, for instance, the cover. The cover is a painting and collage that I did when I was trying to edit the chapter on Lucille Clifton's A Theology of Joy. Like I was trying to, it needed to be restructured and I needed to shift the argument in particular ways. And the only way that I could organize my thoughts around it were by painting this thing. And so it's not just like a decorative thing. It is the process of writing that chapter or rewriting that chapter. And so why hide that part of the process, particularly when this is the argument of the book, right? If I'm going to make this argument, then I'm going to make it seriously. Like all of the kind of attempts to say, yes, the what Barbara Christian is saying, right? Like that our theory as Black folks is in our creative work, is in the novel, it's in the creative production. Why keep reiterating that when I can show you that is the truth, right? And that is the truth of this book. So also when it comes to the linearity, Patient and this book were essentially written at the same time.
It makes sense, but it doesn't make sense any other way.
Right. I'm self-referencing it. A lot of what the poems that came to be, where I'm talking in the researcher's voice, is me trying to figure out this other thing that I'm doing in this book, right? And trying to narrate what's happening with myself in that. So if I wasn't gonna get a job or get tenure or whatever, it just wasn't gonna happen because this is the work at this point. And so I have a fantastic group of colleagues. I obviously had a really dope tenure committee, and a really great press that allowed me to use QR codes. And also that allowed my artwork to be the cover of the book, or actually asked for the artwork to be the cover of the book, because I would have really loved the Roy DeCarbo photograph. And so I got lucky in that sense, but I think I also don't think it's just luck. I think it's there are scholars in the humanities and social sciences that understand that this to be true, that this to be important work. And then also that, I think a lot of people are bored with the idea that scholarship comes in one form, and not just bored, but very aware that it's such a limitation that it's killing various industries at this point. It's killing the book. It's killing the book. It's killing academia itself. It's there are particular ways, and I think this opens stuff up in some ways that could be dangerous too. But to rely on the expository, we can't rely on the expository. The disinformation campaigns that we get show us that we can't rely on the expository. So what are we going to do with how we understand information? And I think there are many ways to re-enter the conversation.
And I should have asked you to introduce yourself. Your name is?
Yes.
So I'm Rama like the Imhotep,
PhD.
PhD.
Dr. Rama Hotel, author of Gossip.
Another Charis favorite in the house. A lot of folks really appreciated that question, Ra, and I'm seeing the Conte Bill in the chat say patient is for real, and taught in my classroom. So
We have another question by Ariel if we have time.
Hello.
Hi.
My name is Ariel Brody. I have to ask. Do you make meaning of the way that you metabolize and process and articulate different information to your reader across genres? And how do you decide what information is brought to us by way of poem, what information is brought to us by way of academic scholastic thought in the more traditional sense, what way is brought to us by QR code? What is the interior of those decisions?
Some of it is, quite frankly, what my limitations are. What the limitations of technology are. You know, there could be questions about, for instance, like, why isn't in the visual field chapter, that chapter has like the least amount of stuff in it from me as a creative person. I have like a couple of poems in there. I don't necessarily have photography in there or like any visual art in that chapter. And that would make sense for a chapter that's about this visual field, right? So some of it is about my limitations with technology as I experience them. And then they are really about my process, like my creative process, which is to say my like intellectual process, I guess, if we're gonna separate the concepts, like my process of doing research, right? So can give another example. I think that the example of the first chapter on grief is like the best one. Of course, the poems came first, right? The poems came first. The little preamble that begins that chapter came second. The notes came last, and which is the opposite of what I guess scholarship is supposed to do, right? Like the notes could very well be the content of an expository chapter on Black grief and Black studies. They are structured in a way that they're notes, right? And that the content is these poems. And the poems were something I knew I wanted to write poems with Tahlequah. I knew I wanted to write sonnets with Tahlequah. I didn't. I guess they're 14-line poems. I knew that those poems needed to be connected, that I wanted to make a series of poems, of 14-line poems that were connected, and that there would be 17 at least of them. And they would show how repetitive and but full of love and broken grief, the grief process could be. So I wasn't able to that was the reasoning. So I guess the answer to your question is I had creative reasonings for things that then I had to go and explain in exposition. And that repeatedly happened. I wrote the chapter on anger, for instance, in one sitting as a reflection of the process of writing Patient. And that's how that came about. It was an exposition of this is what it's like writing patient. And as a matter of fact, this is why anger is important. And so it became this, and so I went, and so the kind of research component of it comes with like this longer history of looking at how Black women's anger kind of functions, looking at, you know, Amos and Andy, the Sapphire character, pulling up Audre Lorde's words on anger, and that whole issue with Black Scholar, that's just this big old ugly fight, and, you know, like doing all of that work on anger comes up as kind of a, like, for me in process, was a backdrop of trying to explain this moment in patient that is autobiographical, where, you know, I say to the doctors, gynecology was built on the backs of Black women. You know, because I knew in that moment all of that other stuff. Like, now is an opportunity for me to describe. So I don't know if that exactly like you know, it answers your question, but those were examples of how it kind of came about, is that like all of it was me trying to practice what I preach, or practice what I preach, practice what Father Christian taught me about where the theory comes from, and then showing the work, essentially. My mom's a school and math teacher. Showing the work.
Show your work, yeah.
So I think in an effort to give everybody time with you one-on-one, we are going to say thank you to our virtual audience and say goodnight to them. I'm gonna encourage y'all who are watching at home, click this teal button at the bottom center of the screen to buy Feelin, Creative Practice, Pleasure, and Black Feminist Thought directly from Charis right now. It really does help us when you buy event books from us. You can also make a donation in support of our nonprofit programming arm, Charis Circle. And for all of you in the room, we are going to invite you, if you would like to get your book signed, you can do that. More books are available for purchase up front. We got folks saying thank you in the chat and clapping for you. So good night to all of y'all virtually. Thank you so much for being with us.